I recently visited the Hawthorn Football Club to interview assistant coach David Rath on different aspects of the game and its development over the years.
My role at the club involves looking at other sports, looking at strategies that we can borrow from them, looking at methods of training and coaching sport, looking at supporting our coaches' decision making with data and developing new ways of measuring and quantifying the game, basically. I think the biggest change in the game has been the way teams defend. It's been an amazing transformation from what was probably nearly a 1v1 defensive structure. Now teams are playing what you call collective defence. I think that's largely been influenced by looking at other sports such as soccer and maybe a little bit of basketball as well. And coaches have borrowed from those sports and applied those principles to footy.
Okay, so are you able to be a bit more specific in how they've borrowed from the other sports? And
so if we look at concepts like zoning and pressing and even flooding, when I began to be involved in football in 2005, teams were probably more playing a flooding game and getting their numbers back and defending in their back end. Sydney and West Coast were playing pretty dour grand finals in those days, and they were based on the idea that we'd protect our goals with our numbers in the back end. Whereas nowadays, teams are saying, let's get the ball into our front end and let's lock the ball in there. So they're looking at getting a zone or a press in place behind that and locking the ball in their front end rather than trying to defend the back end as much. That's been the biggest transformation. Look, I find footy to be an endlessly entertaining game. I don't look at games and think one game style's in essence more entertaining than another. I think there's elements of a contest which are important no matter what style of football you play, and that tends to define the engagement of people in it. I think is the tightness of the contest. I think some people look for a spectacle, and I think some games are more spectacular than others. If we look at some of the finals that have been played recently, probably in the first week of the finals, there were some pretty dour struggles. Some people thought they were good games because they were a dour struggle. Other people didn't like the spectacle of them. I'm not really strongly in either camp. I suppose I do like to see skillful football played, and I can understand people's perspective on that. But football's a really dynamic game, and we can win it a whole lot of different ways. And some people will win it with a contested game style. Others will win it with a more open game style. I think that's one of the beauties of the game. Really good question. I think as a coach with my coaching hat on, I think I like that ability to control a game. We as coaches hate shootouts because shootouts can go either way. And I suppose that was Malcolm Blight's theory, was I don't care if they kick 20 goals as long as we kick 21. The way we've coached, I think we want to be in a more controlled environment and try and dictate strategically how the game's played a little bit more. I think there's a number of factors that have come into it. One, I think that the game's become more professional over a period of time now, and with that becomes better training methods. So players become more skillful as part of that. So that's part of it. But I also think that the way the game is coached has influenced that significantly. With a move away from perhaps a 1v1 defence, then when teams are zoning space, there's the ability for the opposition team to control possession against that and use space outside that zone. So possession has become a more dominant strategy. We've probably been one of those teams that's used that and applied it, and we've been a skillful team over the last 8 or 9 years, I suppose, when we've had some real success. That possession as a strategy has been part of that. So we've trained that hard, and that's worked for us. So it's coaching, it's training, it's the players, it's the defensive systems that are employed. It's a range of things. I think that's probably more on the back of what I mentioned earlier in terms of teams playing pressing and zoning styles of football, that you can lock the ball in, and if you can lock the ball in, then you've got a great ability to apply pressure. So for example, when a player gets the ball in their defensive end and they look up and their exits are covered because there's a really good zone in place, then they've got to try and play their way out of there, and when they're playing their way out of there, they're inviting pressure. So that defensive system has actually created more pressure. Yeah, look, I'm only marginally involved in the recruiting side of things, but we definitely look at a range of factors. We look at their ability to play the game, and they've obviously got to. We want to get skilled footballers in, but we really have a close look at their character. A lot of clubs have a policy of getting good people in and good characters into their footy club, and that's something that we believe strongly in as well. But we want people who actually love the contest as well, and if you've got a strong contested mindset, then that will give you a long or a better chance of actually being successful in the game, because it requires a lot of resilience, and if you don't have that strong mindset, then you're not going to give yourself the best chance. They're probably the main areas. But then I suppose if you're asking about players who are on the lower end of the scale, you're really looking for a strong attribute. So it might be a player who hasn't got everything in their kit bag, but they may have speed, or they may have a step, or they may be incredibly strong and or physical over the ball. So you might not be getting the complete player, but you're looking for someone who's got one attribute that really stands out that gives them a chance. I'm not sure that the stats would back that up. Kicking's been pretty stable. Goal kicking's been pretty stable for a reasonable period of time. I think the greater question is, as the game has improved in professionalism, then why hasn't kicking improved along with that, goal kicking? And I think that comes down to a number of factors. One is that in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we had a lot more specialist goal kickers. So we had full forwards who were taking a greater proportion of shots, and that was their specialist role. Now we have a much greater range of goal kickers. So some games we might have as many as 12 goal kickers in a game. So you've got a broader cross-section of players who aren't necessarily having that specialist skill honed to the same degree as a specialist full forward. Team defences have changed a lot. So we're actually getting shots. We have to take shots from worse positions now. The game is probably more demanding than it's ever been, so players are more physically fatigued, and there's more contested situations perhaps, so that physical battering as well takes its toll. So I think there's a whole range of reasons. I still think there's a scope for greater improvement in goal kicking around the mental side of things. There's gaps there perhaps.
Over sort of last, again, 20, 30, 15, 20 years, 30 years, like that sort of time period, the athletic demands on the game seem to have gone up quite a bit. So, the requirements to run, jump, tackle, all the actual just raw athleticism has been a much higher requirement. Do you think that is going to hurt the skill level of the player, or do you think that will actually improve their skill level because it requires them to be more professional? And do you think that would hurt or hinder the general skill level of the game?
I'm not sure there's necessarily a correlation between physicality or physical prowess of players and skill level as such. I think the skill level is more determined by the nature of the game. Probably the pool of skilled talent is the same. It's how the game demands that of the player to get better. And as the game gets better, players tend to self-organise and get better. And you'll see that in some players in finals, that they actually play better football in finals. As the game heats up, they actually rise to the standard. I think we see that collectively as well, that as the game has matured over even the last 5 years, we've probably seen skills of collective groups of players improve as well. I think that's part of the natural growth of the game. I think one of the big changes in football has been the ability, as defensive systems have changed, the ability to get the ball from one end of the ground to the other. When I first started, if you got the ball in your defensive 50, you were probably 50% chance to get it inside 50 at the other end, because teams were flooding back. So if you got the ball, the opposition would flood back and defend the goals, and you could progress the ball up. And it wasn't a question of whether you could get the ball to the other end. It was whether then you could actually make a reasonable quality scoring chance of that when you got it there. These days that is less than halved. So when you get the ball in your defensive end, you're less than 25% chance of getting it inside 50, because teams are now trying to lock it in. So that's been a dramatic change in the game. I'd say that's probably the standout stat that I've seen. Kicking efficiency tends to waver a little bit. It's probably with possession games, some teams have been able to, keep improving their kicking efficiency, but that's probably more around the strategy of defence. Again, that balance rather than necessarily a massive improvement in skill. There's been a slight improvement in skill, I think. You'd never say never, because it's a strategic threat that if you plonk someone in the goal square and leave them there, then it's a bold team that just lets them stay there and presses up and leaves them out the back. You see that occasionally. You'll see players who don't squeeze up and help out in their team defence as a forward. But even on the weekend in the first final, we saw Geelong and usually you'd say Tom Hawkins as a stay-at-home type forward, but he was really high up the ground, helping out in that team defence. So definitely at the moment you're not seeing it a lot, but it might be something that evolves because the game tends to reinvent itself, and the further a strategy goes, there's no such thing as a perfect strategy in footy, that it's a resource issue. So if you plonk all your resources somewhere, you're going to pay for it somewhere else. So if we're playing a really high pressing game and there's space out the back and you've got someone there, then that's a real threat. So you'd never say never, but it's probably unlikely you'll see the days of a Dunstall, Lockett type thing as a pure forward, I think, because we need forwards to be involved in team defence as well. So I'd say maybe it might swing a bit, but I don't think we'd go back to that day. Yeah, I find it really hard to predict the game, because I think if we've looked at what's happened in the game, we've tried to tweak rules, and sometimes we've changed rules with the mindset of let's change this rule to try and open the game up, and quite often it has the reverse effect, because the game is this self-organising beast and it works out a way, and coaches work out ways around things. Predicting the game is a really tough thing to do, and something that I'm not 100% comfortable with making any bold predictions. You would expect the game to continue to get slightly more athletic as training methods improve. You'd expect skill level to keep rising, but in terms of the style of the play, it really tends to follow the leader. And if you look at what happened when, obviously on the back of the Bulldogs, teams started playing more contested handballing style, that has success for a while, and then teams will work out a better way to defend that, and something else will pop up. So I don't know.
The bounce. Do we get rid of it or do we keep it?
Look, I'm a little bit of a romantic with the bounce. I'm against the odds with this one. A lot of people are saying it's time for the bounce to go, but I like the chaotic element that the bounce provides, and I think it adds something to the game to have. That's one of the beautiful things about our game. It's an oval ball, and it is chaotic, and the bounce is part of that. So I'd love to see it stay.
I considered asking about dribble kicks, but realised it's better to get them out of the game. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I was Matthew Roebuck interviewing David Rath of the Hawthorn Football Club. See you when I see you.